1,600 earthquakes in 2 days, beneath one of the most famous volcanoes in Europe. On the island of Tenerife, home to more than 6 million tourists a year, the ground has been shaking almost continuously since July 22nd, and this isn't even unusual for this mountain anymore. This is the 10th earthquake swarm recorded here just this year alone. So why aren't scientists panicking? And more importantly, should you be worried if you're planning a trip there? Today we're breaking down exactly what's happening beneath Mount Teide, why a volcano can produce over 1,000 earthquakes without erupting, and what would actually need to change for scientists to start genuinely worrying. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the facts, the science, and the real stakes. Drop a comment right now. Have you ever visited Tenerife or Mount Teide? Tell me what it was like. If you want to be the first to know every time something major happens geologically, subscribe to the channel right now. It is completely free. A thumbs up also helps enormously. Let's go for 5,000 likes on this one so the algorithm actually shows it to the people who need to see it. Thank you. Now, let's get into it. What's actually happening beneath Tenerife? Starting on the night of July 22nd, 2026, Spain's National Geographic Institute, known as the IGN, and the Canary Islands Volcanological Institute in Vulcan, detected a new swarm of seismic activity beneath the Las Cañadas del Teide area, on the southwestern side of the Teide Pico Viejo volcanic complex. Over the following 2 days, instruments recorded more than 1,600 individual earthquakes, the majority concentrated near the villages of Guia de Isora, Villaflor, and Santiago del Teide. By Thursday afternoon, roughly 3 days after it began, Vulcan confirmed the swarm had wound down. Nearly all of these earthquakes were classified as low magnitude, generally below 1.0 to 1.5 on the Richter scale, meaning the overwhelming majority were far too weak to be felt by anyone standing directly above them, detectable only by sensitive monitoring instruments buried across the island. This is not a one-time event. Scientific bodies specifically identified this as the 10th distinct seismic swarm recorded beneath Tenerife in 2026 alone, following earlier episodes in February that included a 36-hour swarm producing over 2,500 hybrid earthquakes, at the time the longest such episode recorded on the island in a decade. Both IGN and Vulcan have maintained a consistent public message throughout this entire year of activity. Tourist services across the island continue operating completely normally, with no restrictions of any kind linked to the ongoing seismic activity. Teide National Park, hiking trails, and the mountain's famous cable car have all remained open and unaffected throughout. Why this happens here so often? To understand why a volcano can generate over 1,000 earthquakes in a matter of days without erupting, you need to understand what these specific swarms actually represent. And it's genuinely different from the kind of tectonic earthquake sequences we've covered elsewhere on this channel, like the recent Kumamoto earthquake in Japan or the Venezuela sequence back in June. Both IGN and Vulcan's leading scientific hypothesis for these Tenerife swarms centers on something called hydrothermal system pressurization, driven specifically by the injection of magmatic fluids and gases into the volcano's underground hydrothermal system, rather than magma itself physically forcing its way toward the surface. Here's the distinction that matters. Deep beneath Teide, magma, sitting in a reservoir, continuously releases hot gases and fluids as part of its normal, ongoing degassing process. Those gases and fluids don't necessarily push upward toward an eruption. Instead, they can migrate into the surrounding hydrothermal system, essentially the network of heated groundwater and rock beneath the volcano, and increase pressure within that system. As that pressure builds and shifts, it can crack and fracture rock in small, localized bursts, generating exactly the kind of low-magnitude, rapid-fire earthquake swarms recorded this week. Vulcan specifically points to 2 independent, corroborating pieces of evidence supporting this explanation: an increase in diffuse carbon dioxide emissions at Teide's summit crater, and slight ongoing ground deformation detected in the northeastern sector of the Teide Pico Viejo complex since 2024. Both are consistent with gas and fluid movement within the hydrothermal system, rather than magma actively rising toward the surface. Why scientists aren't alarmed? This is genuinely one of the more important science lessons available from this story, because it directly counters the instinctive assumption that a huge number of earthquakes automatically signals an approaching eruption. Idahiza Dominguez, the IGN's director in the Canary Islands, addressed this directly, describing the current activity as something small and normal for a volcanic island, explicitly stating there is no reason for alarm. Scientists specifically compare this pattern against a genuine recent volcanic crisis in the region. For context, the 2021 eruption on the neighboring island of Palma. That eruption was preceded by earthquake swarms that showed clear, measurable differences from what's happening at Teide now, specifically far higher energy release, a clear migration pattern with earthquakes progressively moving shallower over time as magma physically ascended, and significant accelerating changes in volcanic gas emissions. The Teide swarms recorded throughout 2026 have shown none of those specific warning signs. This matters because it illustrates precisely what volcanologists actually watch for when determining real eruption risk. A number of earthquakes alone isn't the primary signal. A migration pattern, quakes moving measurably shallower over days or weeks, indicates magma is physically forcing its way upward. Significant increases in gas emissions, particularly sulfur dioxide alongside CO2, indicate fresh magma is degassing closer to the surface. Accelerating ground deformation, especially when it speeds up rather than remaining gradual, suggests the crust is being actively pushed outward by rising material. Without these specific accompanying signals, even a swarm producing thousands of individual earthquakes remains, by the current scientific consensus, consistent with normal background activity for an active volcanic system, rather than a precursor to eruption. Tenerife's documented history of these events. This pattern of recurring swarms beneath Teide isn't new, and tracking its full history helps illustrate just how consistently these events have resolved without escalating. And Vulcan's records show comparable hybrid event swarms dating back to October 2016, followed by additional episodes in June 2019, June and July 2022, August and November 2024, and a cluster of distinct swarms throughout February 2026 alone, before this most recent event in late July. Some of those individual episodes were dramatic in their own right. A swarm in one earlier instance produced over 700 small earthquakes within roughly 5 hours. Another generated more than 1,400 events in just 14 hours. In every documented case across nearly a decade of monitoring, these swarms have wound down any accompanying eruption without triggering restrictions on tourism or hiking access, and without the specific migration or gas emission changes that would signal genuinely elevated risk. That said, scientific bodies have not simply dismissed the broader pattern. Spain's IGN confirmed plans to enhance the region's seismic monitoring network specifically in response to the frequency of these events, and officials describe the underlying process, ongoing hydrothermal pressurization, as an active, continuing phenomenon that warrants sustained, close observation even without indicating any near-term eruption risk. In other words, the message from scientists isn't that nothing is happening beneath Tenerife. It's that what's happening is a well-documented, closely monitored process that, based on nearly 10 years of comparable data, behaves very differently from the kind of activity that has historically preceded actual eruptions on the island. What this means, if you're planning a trip, for the millions of tourists who visit Tenerife annually, drawn partly by Teide itself, mainland Spain's highest peak and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the practical takeaway from officials has remained consistent throughout this entire year of seismic activity. The volcano and surrounding national park operate under continuous 24-hour monitoring by both Vulcan and the IGN, using a dense network of seismic instruments specifically designed to detect exactly the kind of migration and gas emission changes that would signal a genuine shift in risk. Tenerife's Cabildo president, Rosa Davila, has publicly reaffirmed multiple times throughout this year of swarm activity that the island, in her words, more prepared than ever for any volcanic scenario, a statement grounded the island's decades of monitoring infrastructure and established response, planning specifically built around this volcano's known behavior patterns. Final thought. A headline reading, 1,600 earthquakes in 2 days, sounds, on its own, the beginning of a disaster story. And in a different geological context, tied to a fault, system capable of producing damaging tectonic earthquakes like the ones we've covered in Japan, Venezuela, or Peru, a number like that would rightly demand serious concern. But volcanic seismic swarms driven by hydrothermal pressurization behave according to an entirely different set of rules. And Tenerife's specific, well-documented, decade of comparable episodes gives scientists a genuinely strong evidentiary basis for their current measured response. The real lesson here isn't that earthquake swarms beneath volcanoes are never worth worrying about. It's that raw earthquake counts alone don't tell the whole story. Migration patterns, gas emissions, and deformation rates matter far more. And this is exactly the kind of nuance that separates informed concern from unnecessary panic. We will keep tracking this story and every other major seismic and volcanic event happening around the world right now. Subscribe so you don't miss it if this pattern beneath Teide ever changes. And leave that comment below. Have you ever visited Tenerife or Mount Teide? Tell me what it was like. 5,000 likes on this video. Let's go. See you in the next one.